Hey everyone, welcome back to the next part of Genshin What If. Last time I discussed potential signature weapon concepts for Xingqiu, Bennett, and Xiangling. Naturally, this series intends to cover every 4-star we have, so let's keep the ball rolling and move on to the next set of characters. I decided it would be nice to group up all the characters into categories based on their kits. It's just a nice way to create a theme for each episode. In the last video, one of the comments was curious to see what my weapon would be like for Sucrose, and I figured she'd be a great candidate to cover. I have her placed in the buffer category, so the full lineup for this video will be Yun Jin, Rosaria, then Sucrose. Before we begin, I'd like to restate my disclaimer from the last video. I'm not a theory crafting master, so when it comes to certain things like min-maxing, attack combos, or team comps, I can't guarantee that my weapon concepts will be the best choice in every scenario, or that I won't miss the mark on some characters. The point of this series is just to make a weapon that can synergize well with the character it's intended for. I'll also be adding calculations to show you comparisons. This only exists to give you a general idea of its numbers and how it compares to other scenarios. If you have critiques or corrections you want to share, you're free to comment down below. Just remain respectful as you do. I'll also drop my personal guidelines for when I make these weapons. These exist either to keep things relatively balanced or to make the process simpler for myself and others. Take a few seconds to pause if you need to read it all. Alright, without further ado, let's start with the first character.
The chirping of the songbirds at daybreak always puts me in the best of moods.
Yun Jin's kit focuses around using her burst to buff the normal attack damage of her party members. This is a buff that scales with her defense. There is another stat that she desperately needs, which is energy recharge. It's recommended that 180 to 200% ER is a good range to have, but every step you take focusing on getting your burst back takes away from the normal attack bonus you get from building defense. When it comes to characters who look for multiple stats, one of the choices I go for with these weapon concepts is finding ways of bridging the gap, and Yun Jin is one of those examples. Her signature weapon, Operatic Sonnet, has a base attack of 454 and a defense substat of 69%. Nice. The passive, Song of People, provides an ER bonus of 0.7 to 1.4% for every 100 defense the user has. This effect lasts for 5 seconds after using an elemental skill. With this weapon, defense gives you ER. This means you can find some comfort building defense to buff your burst, while also not having to worry much about getting your burst back on cooldown. Here, you can see my own build of Yun Jin on the left, with the concept build being on the right. The actual numbers are just isolated examples to give you a general idea of where the stats are at a base level. With Operatic Sonnet, running full defense main stats yields the least ER but the most defense. This brings more value with some investment, but it can be restrictive as you likely have to focus your subset rolls into ER. Meanwhile, running an ER main stat provides the second most defense and ER. This should allow you to be more flexible with your substats, as you can decide which ones you want more of. If you haven't seen the previous video, keep in mind that the every number of stat A equals number of stat B is not cut and dry. For an example in Yun Jin's case, 2050 defense would equate to a bonus of 28.7% ER, not a flat 28%. When it comes to other characters who might be able to use this weapon, I'm sad to say that no one else really wants it. Since Yun Jin is the only defense scaling polearm user, it's practically useless on everyone else.
Nice to meet you. I'm Natasha, an underworld doctor. Feeling sick?
This weapon concept was really fun to come up with, and if you're someone who likes to drink, take a shot every time I say crit. Rosaria is a character who wants to build a lot of crit rate in order to increase her team's crit rate. Using her burst provides a team-wide bonus based on 15% of her own crit rate. This bonus is a maximum of 15%, meaning that Rosaria herself needs a max of 100% to provide the full effect. Lots of weapons have crit rate substats, getting a crit rate circlet builds it up even more, and her A1 passive increases her crit rate when her skill hits an enemy from behind. All of these can result in a value of around 75 to 80% already. And with a few substats, you can reach that 100% threshold. So what's the weapon concept gonna be? Easy, more crit rate. Dark Strider is Rosaria's signature weapon. It has a base attack of 454 and a crit rate substat of 36.8%. The passive, Holy Knight, increases the user's crit rate by 1.5 to 3% every time their elemental burst hits an opponent. This has a max of 4 stacks. Additionally, every 1% of crit rate the user has that exceeds 100% will increase the party's crit damage by 1%. Both effects will last for 7 seconds even if the user is off field. Rosaria as a character has this vibe that just screams overkill, and I wanted her weapon to reflect that as well. I wanted to give her a crit damage bonus somehow, and I figured the most interesting way to do it is to make a weapon that incentivizes going all in on crit rate stats. This weapon may be considered overpowered to some, so I thought the best way to balance it out was to force the player to hard focus on crit rate substats in the artifacts to capitalize on the passive. Let's do the math really quick to show you this weapon's base potential with Rosaria. The base crit rate for any character is always 5%. A circlet provides 31.1% crit rate. Her A1 passive increases her crit rate by 12%. This weapon's substat provides 36.8%, and the passive with max refinement stacks another 12%. This, at a baseline, gives 96.9% crit rate. A couple crit rate substats should put you above 100%, allowing you to A, make full use of Rosaria's A4 passive, and B, start taking advantage of the crit damage passive that the weapon has. There's some flexibility to this weapon that players can decide on for how they build Rosaria. If you only care about hitting 100% with Rosaria for her passive, or you want to focus on personal damage, then using the weapon as a stat stick isn't a bad idea, as you can focus on other stats like attack, crit damage, or ER. If you want to buff your team's damage and run the overkill crit rate build with Rosaria, you should be able to easily surpass 100% and start making use of that crit damage bonus. Just remember, this weapon relies on rolling well on your substats to take full advantage of the passive. Characters that can only use this passive for the weapon include Sino, Hu Tao, and Xiao. This is because they all like crit rate, but their bursts either only deal a single hit of damage, or they only buff their auto attacks. For characters that can use the passive only, we have Candice, Toma, and Yao Yao. All of them can hit multiple times with their burst, but unless you're running a main DPS build, you generally want other stats on them. Not to mention, they don't have that 12% bonus passive like Rosaria does, so getting to over 100% will be a lot harder when you're rolling your substats. For characters that can use the stat and passive, we have Raiden, Shenhe, and Xiangling. All of their bursts have good damage, meaning that crit is a valuable stat, and they hit multiple times, so it's easier to gain the full effect. However, as many of them focus on damage, it might be better to use a crit damage circlet, so reaching over 100% crit rate may be harder, and as such, you may not make much use of the passive. Something to keep in mind is that Shenhe and Xiangling's bursts both snapshot, similarly to Rosaria's. As a result, you're going to want to use this weapon only if you intend to use the playstyle of overkill crit rate, as the additional 12% crit rate from the weapon passive will not go into account when you use their burst. I did some balance testing with the numbers to make sure it wouldn't outperform a 5-star weapon. Here, I tested Rosaria's numbers comparing Dark Strider to the Primordial Jade Spear. I also tested Raiden's numbers comparing Engulfing Lightning to Dark Strider. Color coding for this particular set of calculations is in place so you can see how the different energy recharge values affected her damage.
What was that? Oh, it's gone. Can I go take a look?
Finally, let's talk about Sucrose. The comment I mentioned earlier was curious to see how I could create a weapon better than Sucrose's current best 4-star, Sacrificial Fragments. I gotta say, even if this weapon doesn't exist, finding out a concept was pretty difficult. Sucrose provides a lot of team utility already. Her skill and burst both create moments of crowd control and grouping against certain enemies, and as a Catalyst user, playing her on-field allows her to drive certain reactions like Taser or Aggravate teams. Her being Animo allows her to swirl elements for reactions and run the Viridescent Veneer set for Elemental Shred. Her passive provides a team-wide EM bonus based on her own EM. C6 provides a 20% elemental damage bonus of the burst's absorbed element, and with all that, Sacrificial Fragments is a cherry on top to let her generate more particles for her and her team. So I'm sorry to say, the best I can do for this weapon concept is probably just a side grade at most. Sucrose's weapon, Windborne Opus, has a base attack of 454, an elemental mastery stat of 221, and the following passive, titled Isolated Test. After the user triggers an elemental reaction, all party members gain an elemental base damage bonus based on 35 to 70% of the user's EM. This bonus applies to all elements involved in the reaction, and each element has its own individual timer that can be refreshed. The effect lasts 6 seconds and can occur even if the user is off-field. On a surface level, this weapon is basically a better Hakushin ring. Rather than limiting the bonus to electro reactions though, this weapon will boost the damage of any reaction's corresponding elements. The difference is that instead of doing a damage percent bonus, this increases the base damage of elemental attacks, similarly to how Yun Jin or Shenhe buff their respective damage types. What I find really cool about this concept is how complex it can be when you look at specific elements. For example, a basic Electro Swirl buffs 2 elements, Anemo and Electro. An Electro Charge Swirl buffs 3, Anemo, Hydro, and Electro. Same thing with an Aggravated Swirl, Anemo, Dendro, and Electro. And if we want to get really complex, triggering Hyper Bloom with an Electro Swirl results in a damage bonus for all the aforementioned elements. Generally though, you'll mainly make use of only 2 or 3 elements at a time. So what do the numbers actually look like? Sucrose has the potential to buff so many teammates, but for this example, I use Fischl as the character who gets buffed by Windborne Opus's passive. The boxes labeled in green are the weapon passive bonuses Opus provides, and we look at the damage values for both non-aggravated and aggravated damage. The damage output in both scenarios is pretty high regardless, but you'll notice that there's less value when the damage is already aggravated. This is because quicken reactions also increase the elemental base damage, so when combined with Sucrose's weapon passive, this results in some diminishing returns. Still, let's remember that not every electro hit is going to aggravate, while Opus's passive will continue to take advantage of every hit. So how does this weapon compare to Sacrificial Fragments? Think of it in the same way of how we compared Xingqiu's concept weapon with Sac Sword last episode. You're essentially trading between more damage versus more energy. I made the base attack and substat the same for these weapons so that the only factor you want to consider is the passive. If you want more energy to get your burst back, then using Sac Frags is probably the better option, but if you want to just provide your team with extra elemental damage, then Windborne Opus is the way to go. Technically, every Catalyst user can use the passive, but that bar is pretty low, so I'm not going to list them all. No one wants just the EM substat, but we do have characters who want both EM and the passive: Lisa, Nahida, and Yai. Especially with the Dendro reaction meta, EM for all of these characters has become a valuable stat to look for, and since all of them can deal consistent damage both on and off field, it's very easy to buff your party's elemental base damage with the weapon passive. And that's all for this episode of Genshin What If. If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to support the channel. I'll quickly show you a list of all the characters and categories that are planned to be released. If you have a preference for a specific group or character you want me to cover next, or you have critiques about my concepts, let me know in the comments. I'll see you all next time. Bye!